Mr. President, like many Americans, I've watched with increasing concern and increasing frustration the rapidly growing humanitarian crisis on our southern border. More than 60,000 unaccompanied alien children, mostly minors from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, have been apprehended at the border this year, in this fiscal year, and we have 2.5 months remaining. So the numbers are staggering. Another 40,000 family members, one or both parents traveling with their children, have also been apprehended just in this fiscal year. Now, to put these numbers in perspective, in 2008, the number of unaccompanied alien children apprehended at the border was 8,000. 3 years later, in 2011, the number had doubled. It had doubled to 16,000. So this is something that we perhaps didn't, but should have seen coming. Today, of course, the numbers are staggering, as I just mentioned. It has skyrocketed. In May, in fact, in April and May of this year, 10,000 a month have arrived. So we're going to be well toward the number of 100,000 or more of unaccompanied children or accompanied children with families that are coming here across the border illegally, creating a significant crisis. We simply cannot sit back and let this situation grow worse as it does day by day. We must now find a way to solve this crisis and stem the flow of unaccompanied minors entering our country. It is imperative that this Congress and this administration work together to do this and do this immediately. We dare not move toward our regularly scheduled August recess without accomplishing the solution or resolution of this current crisis, which is impacting children, impacting families, impacting communities, impacting many across the United States in terms of this crisis. Now, as we do this, I think it's important that we be guided by some key principles. Laws currently on the books, laws that might need to be adjusted, as well as compassionate hearts in terms of how we deal with those who are here, but will need to be returned back to their homeland. First, clearly and foremost, we have to enforce existing law. Existing law says we need an orderly process. Immigration needs to be legal. It needs to be processed in an orderly way, in a way that we can accommodate those who come to America. I'm the son of an immigrant who was processed through a legal process. And that speaks for many of us, not only here in this chamber, but many across America. We are all, in a sense, immigrants. But for over 200 years, we have come as immigrants through a legal process. And today, we find a situation where our borders are being swamped with those who are attempting to come illegally for whatever reason. And more importantly, we have to make it clear to them that the law does not allow this to happen. So we have to get control of the border. We have to get control of our immigration process. For those, and I think all of us feel that the need for immigration reform. Step number one has to be securing our borders so we can convince the American people that we have returned to an orderly process of bringing immigrants to this country and not be overwhelmed by the illegal immigration flowing across in these days across the southern borders. It's also important because we need to let the families know and the children know that their trip to America is not what has been promised them. Many believe this humanitarian crisis is focused on how we handle these children once they arrive at the border. And there is a need to address that issue. But in reality, the crisis for these children begins when they start their trip, given the dangers of the journey. We now know that the children who are making these dangerous treks from Central America are often in the hands of smugglers, drug cartels, coyotes, those who, criminal elements who are delivering a false lie to family and individuals in these countries, basically saying, get your children across the border and they will then be absorbed into the American society, and they will be in a better place. And by the way, write us a check for $7,000 or $10,000 or $5,000, whatever the market bears, and we will ensure that your children arrive safely, and then you won't have to worry about them anymore. That is simply not true. Sadly, in the latest information that has come to us, in surveys that are being taken and investigations that are being made, the story is horrendous. Often, those in the hands of those who are seeking to bring them along the approximately 1,500-mile trip from Central America to the Texas border, the reality of what these children are facing, in particular, and these families are facing, is stark, and it's something that absolutely has to be addressed. Doctors Without Borders exist in southern and central Mexico, and they did surveys of those who were attempting to make this trip. They indicated that 58% of their patients suffered at least one episode of violence along their way from Central America to the United States. One media network did an investigation that followed the path of Central American migrants, including children. And while their numbers have not been verified or documented, they are staggering. And even if the results are half of what they claim, it is a situation of immense humanitarian dysfunction. They found that 80% of all migrants will be assaulted, 60% of women will be raped, and 40% of all migrants, and only 40%, will actually make it to the border. Now, let's say those numbers are exaggerated. There's some indication that this media outlet was perhaps sensationalizing their numbers. Let's say it's just half of that. But if it's just half of that, it is something that we absolutely cannot tolerate. We absolutely cannot sit by and say the only humanitarian crisis is taking care of these children once they cross the border, making sure that they have vaccinations, sustenance, a place to sleep until we get them processed. Those that claim that need to understand the crisis that exists before they ever get to the border, and the impact on these children in particular. In 2010, when the narrative coming out of the administration was chipping away at our nation's immigration laws through the abuse of prosecutorial discretion, this generated whispers of hope that ran rampant through the families of our Central American neighbors and gave a false confidence that if you illegally enter the country, once you're there, you'll be able to stay. The belief spread in 2012 when the president took his prosecutorial discretion a step further by essentially halting the removal of illegal immigrants who arrived as minors. There was a process where, of course, they were given a piece of paper which basically said you have to appear before a judge who will determine whether or not you're able to stay in the country or whether you will have to be sent back home. The narrative there was, this is your document that allows you to stay in America. In fact, it wasn't that at all. But because of the overwhelming number of people that receive these documents, allowing them to stay here until they were adjudicated by a judge, because that number now exists around 375,000, and there's no way that we can possibly adjudicate these and make these decisions in a short amount of time. Those that arrived simply melted into the society, and most never showed up before a judge who was making a decision about their legality or illegality. A key part of what we have to do here, in my opinion, is a repatriation plan. Now, it's easy just simply to throw money out there and say, we will come up with a plan later. I cannot support a provision that doesn't have policy changes that address this situation. Policy changes that will allow us to inform our Central American neighbors that they must make every possible effort to engage with us in telling the truth to their constituencies and their parents the parents of these children, as to what lies ahead for them. The fact that they will be subjected to potential brutality, unspeakable, brutal efforts and consequences of this trip, as well as returned back to their families and to their countries. We have to, together, make this message clear that our laws require that these children be sent back, but we also have to make it abundantly clear that they are putting their children at great harm and great risk to believe this narrative that says they'll be fine, they'll be taken care of, just give us the money and we'll make sure your children become Americans and they'll be fine for the future. Secondly, I think we need to go a step further. To deter children from making this journey, we have to return those who have already come. And including in this, in a viable repatriation program, has to be a streamlined process. As I mentioned the number of the hundreds of thousands that are still waiting for their adjudication. There have been efforts and suggestions made here by some of our colleagues, both on a bipartisan basis, that we dramatically increase the number of judges that can go down to the border and make these decisions quickly so that we can safely return these children home without having the horror of seeing these children rejected at different communities and no place to put them, as the numbers simply overwhelm our ability to care for them. The administration does have some flexibility under current law to move families and children through these immigration proceedings in an accelerated manner. However, I believe, and the Secretary of Homeland Security has stated, that we need to go further to change current law to treat all unaccompanied alien children the same. Now, this is the President's own Secretary of Homeland Security, who has been to the border, I have met with and talked to several times, who is assiduously trying to address this in a bipartisan way. And we need to work together to make sure that we put the processes in place and the policies in place before we simply decide on a number and hope for the best later. We need to change the law to allow Central American children who qualify to choose voluntary return as well, rather than go through drawn-out immigration proceedings that should still lead to their removal and damage any chance they have to seek illegal immigration in the future. This narrative out there, this story out there is, oh, well, just go back across the border, then maybe tomorrow you'll get back here and someone else will pick you up and you'll go to a different place and you'll start the process all over again and they'll finally get handed a piece of paper, and then don't worry about showing up 12 to 18 months later. You can melt into society and everything will be well. That absolutely has to be addressed. And if we don't do that, we will not succeed with this process. We also need to use our leverage with these foreign countries to gain their cooperation if they refuse to cooperate with us. Whether it's withholding foreign aid, whether it is any number of punitive measures, we need to make sure that the governments of these nations understand the risk to their children, the harm to their children, and the fact that we are going to enforce the law. And if they want continued future relations with the United States through a legal immigration process, they have to work with us to convince their constituencies and to give them the truth as to what is happening to their children, to engage in this process of working with us to stop this flow of illegals. Now, obviously, we have to provide reasonable care for those that are already here. The vast majority of the new funding the President's requesting would go for caring for illegal immigrants who are already here. It includes housing, transporting, and caring for the children and families already in the United States. I believe it's our responsibility as a nation and as a compassionate society to care for the hurt and displaced. But we cannot simply open our arms and encourage all the world's children to strike out on their own, face endless dangers, and come to our shores with the belief that they will be welcomed and accepted and integrated into our society. We simply don't have the capacity to do that on a worldwide basis, and we see the trouble we're having from just three countries. What are we actually doing to stem the flow of unaccompanied alien children coming to the United States? And when will we begin to see the tide turn? That is something that has to happen and must happen initially. And finally, in addition to the care which we must provide, the sustenance and the health care and the bedding and the nutrition and the efforts that we need to make, and thank goodness for so many nonprofit organizations, churches, and others that have volunteered to join us in this particular effort. But it can't be an ongoing effort. It has to be something that is accompanied by significant changes that I've talked before in terms of policy. You've got to stop the bleeding. You've got to stop the effort first and convince the American people that we've finally gained control of our borders before we can move to any kind of sensible immigration reform. This is going to be expensive. We're going to have to make sure that the money we're spending is spent as part of a plan to address the problem, not just simply address it and have the problem continue, but address it in a way on a one-time basis that we put an end to this story that send your children and they'll be just fine. Mr. President, the time is moving on, and I know my colleague here is waiting to speak and that we have votes coming up. So let me shorten this by simply concluding. At the end of the day, we have a huge humanitarian crisis on our hands, on our border. And I believe we have a moral responsibility to swiftly address and solve this crisis. We have to understand that the crisis involves more than just unaccompanied minors. We cannot ignore the national security implications of a weak border. There are many dark powers in this world that wish to see the influence of the United States diminish, that wish to extinguish the beacon of freedom that we have been to the world. So for the sake of the rule of law, for the sake of our national security and the safety of these children, it is imperative that we act now and that we get it right. And it'll only happen if this body, the Congress, the House and the Senate, and the President will work together to put in place on an expedited basis a sensible plan to address this humanitarian crisis. Save the children. Save the children means don't put those children in the hands of smugglers, coyotes, criminal elements, put them on the buses and the trains only to reap the unintended consequences that they think are consequences that are horrendous and really have become the humanitarian crisis that we're addressing. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.